Jasiri, thank you so much for being here with us this morning.
Thank you for having me.
Your organization, One Hood Media, has been involved in community organizing for years. What was going on in Pittsburgh at the time that you started the organization, and kind of what has changed since then, or what hasn't?
Well, two things. Really, in 2006 is kind of when we really began to form One Hood as an organization, as an overall organization. It was really a response to the violence that we saw, the community violence that we saw in Pittsburgh. I don't like to use the word black on black crime. I feel like that's a white supremacist term. People commit crime where they live. But we saw a lot of community violence, and we felt like one of the things that was happening in our community was that even though we all suffer from poverty, from community violence, police brutality, lack of affordable housing, we were taking our frustrations out on one another. So the concept of One Hood is, through our unity, we can really come together and deal with the systemic problems that we're facing. In 2010, we launched One Hood Media, and that really came out of a study that the Heinz Endowment and the Pew Center did around how the media in Pittsburgh specifically covers black men. 90% of the time is crime. When it came to quality of life stories about black men, it's less than 3%. And so we began to kind of build out a space. Initially that was for young black boys specifically, but now for just youth of color in general, to begin to not only analyze media, but create media for ourselves and kind of tell our own stories, utilizing social media and utilizing the fact that technology is now more affordable to give our youth the tools to kind of tell their own stories. And that's, to me, a powerful thing. I think, sadly, when I look at when we started to now, not a lot has changed. We're still dealing with a lot of community violence. We're still dealing with, police brutality. One of the first things we did as a collective at One Hood is we advocated for a woman named Pamela Lawton, who a police officer pulled a gun on her 7-year-old daughter and threatened to blow her brains out. And although there were 6 witnesses to this, the police officer was not charged with the crime. 6 months later, he killed a mentally ill man. And so I think that's the disappointing thing. I feel like, we have, the one thing that has changed in this last year is the conversation is being held. The conversation is being amplified, but still I haven't seen really any concrete changes that I could point to say, okay, this is Pittsburgh taking a pathway forward.
Of course. I want to talk about you for a second. You began your career as a rapper making music on the internet and talking a lot about injustice, and now you're a community leader in Pittsburgh. Tell us about your journey, art and activism. Was that always something that kind of unfolded together?
It did, but kind of really organically. I'm as a hip hop fan, and my story was really simple. My best friend at the time got turntables for Christmas. He said he was going to be the DJ. Why don't you write a rap? I wrote a rap. It was terrible. But people encouraged me. The people around me encouraged me to continue to write, and I began to find my voice. And, I'm originally from the south side of Chicago. My mother decided to move us to Monroeville, Pennsylvania, so that was a severe culture shock for me. And so when I was writing raps, I was kind of writing what I was dealing with at the time, and I was dealing with kind of a lot of racism. I was dealing with these issues. So I wanted to always be an artist that used music, put message into music, and I was just told over and over again, nobody wants to hear conscious rap. This is not how you make it in the music industry. So I actually stopped rapping, and when we started One Hood, I was just looking at, at the time I was working for Pittsburgh Public Schools, doing case management and counseling for teen fathers, and looking at a solution to, the young men I'm dealing with, mostly were young black men, either being incarcerated or being murdered, and wanting to have some type of solution and wanting to be proactive. I ended up, putting a song out about this situation, the Gina 6, which, 6 young men in Gina, Louisiana were charged with attempted murder for fighting high school. And I put it on, if y'all remember MySpace, I don't know if you remember. Put it on MySpace. And never thinking that this song would be played all over the country and that it would thrust me into a place where I could be an artist. And that, because I did a song about the Gina 6, that when the officers who killed Sean Bell in New York City were found not guilty, that people then would come to me and say, you need to write a song about it. And so it was really me doing art out of the passion that I had, which was, servicing my community, helping, these next generation of folks kind of develop and grow. And so it definitely came organically out of the activism that I do. So I consider myself an activist first because my artistry is an extension of my activism.
Absolutely. You mentioned earlier that the thing that has changed the most for you in the last year is folks being willing to have a different kind of conversation.
Right.
What has your work in Pittsburgh and the activism you've done taught you about America in this moment? Like, are there any connections that you see to the conversations that America is happening?
Well, so for me, because I'm an artist and I have done things nationally, specifically around issues of police brutality. I was the first artist to do a song about Oscar Grant. And then was able to go to Oakland, California, and actually witness firsthand, the movement to get justice for Oscar Grant. I was the first artist to do something about Trayvon Martin and was able to connect with Trayvon Martin's family and that movement to get justice for Trayvon. I was in Ferguson shortly after Michael Brown was killed with the organization called the Gathering for Justice, which started by, to me, the most influential artist activist of our generation, Harry Belafonte. And, in 2014, we actually had a panel discussion called, Could Pittsburgh Be the Next Ferguson? And it was treated like, particularly like the police were very angry that we just titled this conversation that. And, they were calling, like, do we have to have, like, a whole bunch of officers there? And we're like, no, we're talking, like, and we're not meeting to say that we want Pittsburgh to be the next Ferguson. We're actually trying to have the conversation so we would not be the next Ferguson. And so to see this happen here in the city of Pittsburgh in the way that it is, I feel like a lot of ways the music and stuff and the activism that I've done around the country prepared, me for what took place in Pittsburgh over this last year. To me, what it tells me and in terms of the conversation in America is that you don't value, as a black person, you don't value my life and my humanity the same way you do white people or other races and communities. I mean, this is why the call has been Black Lives Matter. You know what I'm saying? Because it's that idea that, like, when I'm killed, then Antoine was on trial. The trial wasn't a trial of Michael Rossfeld. It was Antoine being on trial. And it was really always like, how do we justify this person's death? KDKA put out a story that said, oh, Antoine was on video shooting a gun. He had gunpowder residue in his hands. That was totally false, but it was like trying to create this narrative to justify a black person's death. We don't see that, when other races are tragically killed. And so for me, I think that's what it's, but America's always shown me that, and particularly, no disrespect, when I came to Pittsburgh. I saw it very clearly coming from a black community, almost 100% black community, to almost a 100% white community, how differently I was treated in any type of interaction that I had in the city. And so to me, that's the thing. And just the caveat to say that, even like saying Black Lives Matter, like the fact that that's controversial is insane to me. You know what I'm saying? Because like we're not saying only Black Lives Matter, and we're not saying Black Lives Matter more. So if you in your own mind put that in there, like, that's your issue. And so there's no reason to come and say all lives matter, because mathematically, if all lives matter, you wouldn't have me having a problem saying Black Lives Matter. But this is like what America does. And so that's why I make the music that I do, and that's why I do the activism that I do. All we want is equality. All we want is justice. All we want is equal rights. That shouldn't be a lot to ask, particularly when you have a country that says this is the ideals, but don't live up to them.
Absolutely. You mentioned Antoine Rose, and I want to spend a little bit more time talking about his case. The officer who shot him was acquitted in March. What does the community want to see now after that decision, and how have you seen the district attorney respond to all of the protests and things that have happened in the months since?
Right. I think also it's important to even go back that when Rossfeld, we have to really thank the young woman who recorded that incident, because I believe without her recording and we actually seeing an unarmed Antoine Rose running away of no threat to this police officer when he was shot 3 times in the back, we wouldn't even have this conversation. So the first protest started was just to even get this officer indicted on a homicide charge. But when the officer was indicted, he was actually given an unsecured bond, which is against the Pennsylvania Constitution. They literally, on a homicide charge, said, you can just go home. You don't even have to put up any money. And so when we began to object, they were like, oh, well, we'll put you on house arrest. But the young man who did the shooting that kind of led to these events unfold, he shot somebody, he did a crime, nobody died, he was given a $250,000 secured bond. So I think this is where we first start to see, particularly if you're a black person in Pittsburgh, here we go. Here we go. Like, okay, we got him indicted, but then he's allowed to be on house arrest, and then now, we have to bring a jury in from Harrisburg, and then we're kind of seeing, so you're seeing the steps play out, you know what I'm saying? So by the time we even get to the trial, where the city spent millions of dollars, like putting a fence around the courthouse and officers around the courthouse, and I remember being down there and saying, well, who is this? Obviously, this is not to protect me. Like, who is this to protect, and what message are you trying to send where every protest that we've done has been peaceful? And so I think, like anything, I mean, we want justice. And because, sometimes people try to conflate, like, well, what about, like, black crime in the black community? Well, when somebody in the black community is murdered and that person is arrested and that person is sent to jail, particularly if it's on video and we know who that person is, if that situation happened and that person was found out guilty, we would have an issue with that too. So all we want is justice. We saw Antoine running away. We saw he was no threat to the officer. But the fact that an officer can just say, oh, I thought he had a gun, so I shot him, and then we can all be okay with that? And, the Post-Gazette can say, oh, well, we got a verdict. Y'all got to move on now. Oh, no, I don't think so. Sorry, Post-Gazette, but you're not going to tell us what we can and cannot do. Obviously, we didn't get justice in this case.
So I'm going to ask my last question before we give the audience an opportunity to ask them. How are you thinking about moving forward? Obviously, there is so much momentum when these tragic events happen immediately afterward.
Right.
How are you thinking about going forward? What does the community need from us all now?
And so we've been moving forward really with legislation. Summer Lee, who I believe is going to be speaking later, and organizations like APA, which is headed by Brandy Fisher, really begin to talk about changing the use of force law, like preventing it to where a police officer can't just say, oh, I felt threatened, and now I'm justified to do that. So it's a package of legislation. We're also looking at, folks like Fawn Walker from Take Action 9 Valley has been heading up a conversation around the Allegheny County Civilian Police Review Board for all of these different municipalities in Allegheny County, because if I have to drive from Pittsburgh to East Pittsburgh, Antoine wasn't from East Pittsburgh, but oftentimes when we drive through, particularly as black people, through these smaller municipalities, we actually get a higher level of surveillance, a higher level of profiling from officers, a higher level of harassment. How are we looking at, the oversight when it comes to all these different municipalities in Allegheny County? And we're still, embracing and showing love to Antoine's family. Antoine's mother is one of the strongest people I've ever seen. She's become more active politically and in the community. Although we lost the DA race primary, that might not be a race that's over as well. You had mentioned, I felt that the DA's office not only didn't really want to try the case, but, when Zapala was running I was at all of these community conversations where he was invited to all of these conversations to come and address specifically the black community and did not show up at one. And so now if you're going to then tell me that your office is going to be an office that is sensitive to my needs, and you can't even set foot in my community, look me in the face and have a conversation about how your office really, to me, prevented The prosecution of this officer, I'm not feeling that.
Absolutely. Do we have any questions at this time? We'll have mic runners. One in the back, I see. Take a moment for us to get a mic to you. Please say your name and ask your question.
Oh, thanks. Hi, my name is Waverly Duck, and I was curious. Pittsburgh has lost over a fourth of its black population, and you're talking about Antoine Rose. How should we address the issue that a lot of these suburban communities, inner ring and outer ring suburban communities, are not equipped to deal with the changing demographics? So we're seeing people in Pittsburgh being pushed out into places like East Pittsburgh, Wilkinsburg, Penn Hills, Swissville, where you can see the demographics are changing. How do we extend this conversation not only for Pittsburgh, but some of the surrounding areas? So A, people being displaced from these communities, and then B, how do we start doing activism in some of the surrounding areas where a lot of black people are being displaced, where there's a disproportionate number of black populations, but people in city government, law enforcement are predominantly white?
Yeah, I mean, we are having those conversations, and we are active in those areas, particularly when we talk about Penn Hills and Wilkinsburg. I think because Antoine was killed in East Pittsburgh, it really caused us to look at what was happening in the Mon Valley, which is an area that doesn't get the attention that it really deserves. But I think it's also interesting that, because I think if you ask, these police officers, these populations, they would probably argue that they weren't racist and they're colorblind and they see everybody the same, but then when we move out there, all of a sudden it's a different conversation. So it's like, how do I prevent somebody from being racist? Believe me, if I knew, if I had that power, I would be out there right now. But I think it's like, how do you begin a process where particularly white people face their own privilege? Face up to the fact that this is a white supremacist society, that race does indeed matter in your quality of life, particularly in places like Pittsburgh. If we can't even begin that conversation, we'll never get to the point where we can go out. If we're not safe in Pittsburgh, we know we're not going to be safe in these other areas, but that's the conversation that has to begin. And is that for us to do? I would really, like more well-meaning white people to begin to have conversations with their relatives, friends, and families to make it a little bit easier on me, so maybe I don't have to do all the heavy lifting.
Thank you. Do we have one more question? In the back?
All right.
Oh, right here in the front. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir. Yes.
But actually, I live in North Versailles, which is right next to East Pittsburgh.
100%.
Being
Yes.
concerned as I am, I spoke to the magistrate there as well as the chief of police, and we're hooking up a program called Healing and Building Bridges. And I want to speak to you a little later. I need your help a great deal in that endeavor. I just want to thank you again for what you're doing and keep up the good work.
Absolutely, and let's connect, and thank you for that work. Like I said, I mean, the conversation has began. What I would like to see, I really feel like we don't have that much more time to talk. And particularly when oftentimes in Pittsburgh for black people, it's a life and death situation if these policies don't actually change. So I would call on, let's continue to be active. Let's continue to have these conversations. Let's continue to build. But it's for local government, for the business community, the tech, this new social innovation, Pittsburgh. Let's make Pittsburgh a city that's livable for everybody, not just a select few that can come here and afford to be here.
Well, Jasiri, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Come off with me, Lisa.